Hey everyone! After the set has been drafted for set design and construction purposes, the construction crew can fabricate the set with their tools and materials. In this lesson, we'll describe the best practices of working with measuring, power, and pneumatic tools to make a Hollywood studio flat. So, why are the building blocks of a set called Hollywood flats? The two overall recipes for a flat are East Coast or Broadway flats and West Coast or Hollywood flats. The frame of the Broadway flat sets the face of the lumber proud of the plywood skin. The reason for this is that when a Broadway or theater style flat needs to be moved for scene changing purposes, they are pulled into the wings of the theater or raised above the stage via a fly system. Thus, since the flat is only about an inch thick, it will likely not interfere with the lighting positions or curtains also above the stage. Hollywood-style flats set their framing pieces with the edge proud towards the plywood skin. Thus, the flat has a thicker profile, allowing them to more solidly stand on the floor of the stage or location. Flats have a skin made up of plywood that will be painted after the walls have been installed and seamed. The frame of the flat consists of dimensional lumber called 1x4s that create a support structure for the flat and the wall. The plywood skin is attached to the frame. The framing pieces all have specific names and dimensions to fit within the overall dimensions of the flat. Flats are just the building blocks of the overall walls. We will show you one recipe of how to make a Hollywood-style flat with these building materials. In order to support the flats on the stage floor, an angled support piece is attached with screws to the back of the flats called jacks. The jack prevents the wall from tipping over. On a soundstage, the flat may not be attached to the concrete floor. Thus, a sandbag, or as you'll learn in GFA 1, dirt, is placed on the bottom of the jack. Flats are dimensioned by the set designer or construction coordinator based on the needs of the set. However, there are a few common measurements that are used when planning material needs for the set. The heights of either 8 feet or 10 feet and a width of 4 feet is common recipe for a Hollywood flat. The reason for this dimension is because the plywood we skin the frame comes in 4 feet by 8 feet dimensions. I wish there was a much more interesting reason why these dimensions are used, but in set construction we appropriate from so many of the trades because we recreate fake sets from residential, commercial, and industrial tools, materials, and methods. Since the individual flats become a wall, you can effectively put together a set with two 4-foot by 8-foot flats and a 2-foot by 8-foot header, like you budgeted in Lesson 8. The T-shaped seams that you see where the flats are attached together with screws are covered with tape and mud that will be discussed in an upcoming lesson. Otherwise, you can take two 4-foot by 10-foot flats and attach them together to make the same 8-foot by 10-foot wall. One benefit of this method is you only need to cover one vertical seam. The drawback is that 4-foot by 10-foot plywood cannot be purchased at a home store like Home Depot or Lowe's, and lumber yards will require that you purchase a few hundred sheets. So if you recall what a single sheet of plywood costs from your material estimate worksheet, you'll note that it would be expensive to buy so many sheets of plywood to make one wall. Otherwise, the tools and materials that you need to make flats are readily found at retail home stores. One way to introduce the two primary steps to make a flat is to associate the material with the task. The frame of the flat provides structural support to the wall, and the skin of the flat replaces drywall or sheetrock in residential construction. 1x4 dimensional lumber is used for the frame, and Luan plywood is the material used as the skin. So for the next few minutes, it may benefit you to separate your notes into framing and skinning categories. 1x4 lumber does not actually have a dimension of 1 inch by 4 inch. Instead, this is a descriptive or nominal term for the material as the lumber was harvested, kiln dried, planed, and sanded down to an actual dimension of 3/4 of an inch thick by 3.5 inches wide. The tool that most frequently cuts the 1x4 in the shop is the miter saw. Miter means angled, so the 1x4 is usually cut at 90 degrees. However, the armature of the saw can pivot to several other degree settings. Remember, when using any tool to perform construction work, always wear appropriate PPE. The tool that most frequently cuts the Luan plywood is either the table saw or the panel saw. The panel saw excels at cutting large sheet goods like Luan because it is very safe and all the cutting hardware is housed away from the operator. Generally, you can only cut with two directions on a panel saw. You can cut from the top down or from the left to the right. For your panel saw, consult the tool manual for the directions to safely operate the saw. Whereas the previous tools have motors that perform cuts because of electrical power, pneumatic tools use compressed air to drive tool mechanisms to perform specific work. The two most frequent pneumatic tools that are used to build a flat are quarter-inch narrow crown staplers or upholstery staplers. The narrow crown staplers attach 1x4s to make the frame, and the upholstery stapler skins the plywood to the frame. Each stapler fires a different type of fastener, so please operate the tool according to the manual. For example, the staples from the narrow crown stapler are 1.5 inches in length. So when you fire these staples in the lumber, if you're not careful, one of the legs of the staples could poke out the side and puncture you. So the minimum safe distance that you should hold the lumber is 3 inches from where you are firing the staple. Now, we've explained the flats in terms of the overall outside dimension, but we haven't covered the measurements of the framing underneath the skin. As you're looking at the framing pieces, remember the 3/4 inch edge is proud of the plywood, so the gray rectangles are 3/4 of an inch thick. The top and bottom pieces of the flat are called rails. The rails are cut at the full 4 feet width of the flat. Please recall that we write feet and inches, even if we have an even number of feet. The sides of the flat are called stiles, and the third vertical piece is called a center brace. All 3 vertical pieces are not cut to the full height of the flat. So in order to determine the cut length of the vertical pieces, you would need to take the thickness of the top and bottom rail and subtract that from the overall height of the flat. If the flat is 10 feet high overall, then the stiles and rails would be cut at 9 feet 10.5 inches each. The length of the horizontal struts, called toggles, must also compensate for the thickness of the 1x4s. So instead of the rails getting in the way, we need to focus on the 2 stiles and the single center brace thicknesses. However, you cannot just take the 3/4 inch thickness multiplied by 3 and subtract from the overall width. Instead, you must also divide by 2 because the center brace is in place directly in the center of the flat. Thus, with this formula, the length of one toggle is 22 7/8 inches. You can also express the same dimension both in feet and inches. Thus, 1 foot 10 7/8 inches is the same dimension and would be acceptable answer on a test. Now for a challenge in the lesson. If the flat is 8 feet in height instead of 10 feet, how long do you cut your vertical pieces? Remember, take your overall height and subtract the thickness of the rail multiplied by 2. The correct length of vertical pieces in our flat recipe that has an 8 feet overall height, it would be 7 feet 10.5 inches. So now that we've described the tools and materials used for making a flat, I'll be demonstrating in the next video how to put the pieces of the flat together. Then, after the flats have been built, they need to be placed on a stage or location. In the next lesson, we'll show you how flats become walls. See you then.